Madam Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Let me warmly welcome Her Excellency Hala bint Maziad Al Tuajairi and the honorary delegation members, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Your Excellencies, Saudi Arabia traditionally developed family and women policy, implementing many awareness-raising projects on the prevention of violence and trafficking, created stealth shelters and hotlines for the victims, adopted several national action plans on the prevention of domestic violence and trafficking. State policy directly based on the supporting demographic situation, implementation of e-government services and high technologies. At the same time, I appreciate with the state party activities for the harmonization of legislation and measures, including for the adoption of international standards, especially on the prevention of trafficking. Adoption of the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act and prosecuting and punishing perpetrators. This act prohibits all forms of trafficking persons mentioned in Protocol of the Prevent, including especially transnational organization crimes. However, domestic workers continue to lack adequate labor protections, perpetrating high risk of forced labor. There are problems in the process of systematically screening vulnerable populations for trafficking indicators, including individuals in detention centers, those seeking police assistance for alleged employee abuse, the large number of migrants deported and these penalized for immigration or prostitution violations, which may be a direct result of beginning trafficked or exploited. Furthermore, the hotlines of the National Committee of Combat Human Trafficking and often of the Human Rights Commission are available on the two languages, and at the same time accessibility is not such kind of possible. How does the state party ensure that potential cases of trafficking, including complaints brought by migrant workers and other vulnerable populations, are proactively screened for trafficking indicators, and that potential trafficking victims are not themselves penalized for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of being trafficked? Penalization, deportation, and potential trafficking of victims. How you see the ways how to resolve these questions? Implementation of international conventions and national legislation acts. You have adopted more than 20 years ago the main Palermo Protocol and other conventions, but what about the implementation standards, especially on the place? Statistic data on the victims of trafficking in Saudi Arabia, problems of identification of victims sometimes we see on the place. The small number of the home shelters to shelters are rehabilitation for victims of human trafficking and the continued risk for forced labor with regard to female domestic workers. On the other hand, we note with concern that despite the great efforts made by the state party to combat human trafficking, it does not fully meet the standards for elimination of human trafficking. And domestic workers still lack adequate labor law protections equals to the enjoyed by the other private sector workers, and they be excluded from the recent reforms, which led to the continuing high risk of the forced labor. That's why. Does the state party have any future plans to increase the number of shelters for victims of human trafficking, especially supporting creation of NGO shelters? And if you can provide by state data on the NGO shelters and state shelters and places for the victims of special trafficking, it will be good. And facts on the prohibition against employees confiscated workers' passports and from charging requirement fees during these years. How are the state agents ensure all people in shelters or detained centers are screened for the potential trafficking indicators? And here we are coming for the middle question of the trafficking in this region, especially one more time. How does the state party delineate victims of the trafficking and perpetrators? And how protect the women forced for the prostitution and forced labor? We want to clarify the level of the implementation of international standards in your country on the prevention of trafficking. Shukran.